This building was built with a pretty impressive vision by the stakeholders that were a part of it to be differentiated from what dense urban construction actually looks like now. You basically have this building that, for all intents and purposes, you're in New York. It's one of the most difficult markets to do new construction in, from a safety standpoint, from a regulation standpoint, and just from a land price and cost per foot standpoint. Everything is working against you. So the fact that the developers and the stakeholders that were a part of this building were able to achieve this in and of itself is something that's a really, really big deal. So the end result of why this building is so important is because it saves almost 900 tons of CO2 per year, which is equal to about the planting of 5,300 new trees every year. And so if you kind of scaled that, if every new building in New York was built to that same standard, that would be an unbelievable reduction in the city's carbon emissions.
In a world increasingly facing the challenges of climate change, with the Building Green podcast, we will dive deep into the intersection of architecture, design, urbanism, and environmental responsibility. I'm Ladina Schöpf, your host. I've been an architect and building site manager for the past 10 years. During my studies at ETH in Switzerland, as well as in my working environment, I've had many touchpoints with sustainability, like many of you, I guess. I've also learned to question what I've been told, which is why I decided to go deeper into the topic and uncover what sustainability actually means. My mission is to highlight the transformative power of sustainable architecture, not just as a practice, but as a catalyst for broader societal change. Subscribe for more of our content and enjoy the show. So in today's episode of Building Green, I'm excited to welcome Akbar Hassonjee. Do I even say it right?
Hassonjee, yeah.
Hassonjee. You're a Senior Investment Analyst at Kettler in Washington, D.C. Join us as we discuss the integration of sustainability in investment decisions, the economics of green building, and Akbar's contributions to sustainable projects, shedding light on how financial analysis and ecological responsibility can coexist in the real estate sector. Akbar, with your extensive background in real estate finance and your passion for smart, clean building technologies, could you share how your journey led you to focus on sustainability in your investment analysis at Kettler?
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you for inviting me and having me here today. I've had a pretty crazy winding journey through real estate. It's definitely not the way I think most people do it, but it's worked out, thankfully. So I am originally from New Jersey on the East Coast of the United States. I grew up pretty close to New York City, and I went to college at New York University, and I graduated in 2017. So it's been about, 5 or 6 years, give or take. And coming out of New York, I was there at a time when sustainability in kind of many different industries was really burgeoning. And I was fortunate to work part-time at something called the Urban Future Lab, which is to date, I think, New York's only clean technology and sustainability focused startup incubator. So it's housed within the university in partnership with a couple of different industry institutions. And basically what they do is they find startups addressing sustainability. They give them a physical home to office out of, and also, help them find investors and resources and things like that. So that really opened my eye to everything that was going on in the sustainable realm. And there were a few companies that really inspired me that I kind of keep back in mind, as I go through today. Companies that are known as Radiator Labs, Block Power, Agrilist, and one called 475 High Performance Building Supply. And I name all these companies because they're specifically involved in, energy retrofitting or energy efficiency management for older building stock, and all of these different problems that affect larger cities that have really old buildings, where the climate problem is a lot more pressing because these old cities also just have the highest population. So it's kind of like the perfect storm of things that are happening. And so I particularly did an internship at 475, which is a startup that focuses on basically supplying building materials specifically for passive house architecture. And so I guess to expand on my background, I have no technical experience as an architect or an engineer. And I kind of just fell my way through, building design and building science. And this company taught me a lot about what airtight and, energy efficiency design looks like today. And so the company is named after the Passive House building standard, which originated in Germany at the Passive House Institute in Darmstadt in the late 90s. And essentially, the energy efficiency requirement for a building to be passive house is 4.75 kilo BTUs per square foot per year. And so that's kind of where they take their motif from. And I basically learned about tape and membranes and OSB and sheathing and all these weird, very granular details of building construction when you actually, encapsulate them into one strict standard. They can, through conventional techniques, reduce building energy use by ridiculous amounts, like 80 to 90%, depending on the size and scale of the building you're working on. So learning about all this stuff as a college student definitely fired a lot of, explosions and ideas in my head because I was being exposed to it for the first time. And hand in hand with learning about passive house, I was also exposed to companies focused on modular and prefab construction. And there are quite a few kind of in the industry right now. But I basically learned about both of these things simultaneously, where you have one end of the spectrum where companies are building housing and commercial building stock as basically Lego sets on a factory floor, completely, weather independent of any weather and extraneous problems, and delivering buildings essentially as a kit of parts. And then on the other end of the spectrum, you have designers that are trying to use typical techniques that everybody's used to in construction, but making the most stringent, airtight, and completely sealed buildings that you can possibly make to fully reduce the energy use just at that level. And so when you combine the two, that's kind of been an idea and sort of like a background spark I've been thinking about is how do you make, prefabrication and passive house standards the new standard for all building construction going forward. And that's not the perfect solution, but I think it's something big that could hopefully carry forward. So I learned a lot about those things in New York. And the modular aspect in particular really captured my interest. So after I graduated, I ended up at a startup pretty far down south in the southeast United States in Birmingham, Alabama, called Blocks. It's a company called, they formulated out of an architectural studio. It's spelled BLOX. And they have a very simple methodology to where by prefabricating almost every aspect of the physical structure of a building, and in Blocks' case, specifically healthcare and hospital construction, they can essentially cut everything in half. So their goal is to cut project costs in half, cut the schedule in half, and achieve 50% more value in the energy efficiency and labor savings at kind of the exit when they deliver the building. And so it's kind of their methodology of 2 by 2 by 2. And so I was there while the company was really trying to scale, every aspect of their production facilities to making new product lines. They were basically compartmentalizing their business model to sell things like bathroom pods that you can kind of just sell off to companies, sort of like a retail thing where you might go to Amazon or Costco and order like a freestanding structure for your home. That's sort of the approach they were offering to larger companies. But they've now since evolved into building these whole scale, freestanding emergency departments, urgent care centers, and all these sort of turnkey solutions for modular construction that deliver really fast buildings. So that was very interesting. And it was a year and a half where I got in the weeds on industrial engineering and, what it's like to work in a factory and also what it's like to take the conventional construction mindset and make it work in the same sphere where, you have super efficient people building cars and airplanes and now hopefully buildings. So I enjoyed that a lot, but I realized that I wanted to leverage modular and sustainable design closer to the ownership level where I realized, the real decisions were actually being made. So I ended up going back to New York. I found a job at a brokerage called Compass. So this was kind of like my front-facing experience in the industry, closer to actual sales and marketing of new properties, understanding how brokerages even work, how they attract agents, how they kind of set up their footprint dynamically across many different markets at the same time. So it was less of a sustainability focus and more so just on, where do people set up shop? Where are people moving? Where and what techniques are these sales and marketing firms using to take up market share in a world where everybody has so much information at their fingertips? You have Zillow and you have all these tools you can use to where it's almost making the traditional real estate agent a little irrelevant. But Compass was basically trying to beat that right at the forefront by making the agent themselves the most information equipped professional possible, so that you still need, that human touch to take you through that process. So I learned a lot through there. And I got to help out a little bit with their expansion footprint right up until the pandemic hit the world in early 2020. And at that point, I kind of went through a pivot in my career. I ended up pursuing a business degree at Rice University. So I moved kind of from the East Coast US all the way to the Southwest in Texas, which is a pretty big move. And I ended up in Houston, where there are a lot of the world's, major preeminent real estate firms developing, owning, property managing, and et cetera. One of them being Hines, others being a lot of larger capital groups that are based in Houston, but have portfolios spanning, the entire world. And so I spent 2 years there focusing on real estate finance and trying to continue my studies on sustainability and project-based learning on the side. I got a chance to work on various case studies and projects that had those things at the forefront, with not only sustainability, but other ESG initiatives like social economics and housing that addresses different income levels, building community amenities and things like that. And that was where I really got exposed to how kind of the development process actually works, where an owner buys a piece of land or buys an existing property, how they would imagine a business plan, and how they kind of use all the stakeholders in the process to address what their goal is, whether that's to make market rate housing, to make a mixed use campus of some kind, or anything. So it was really great. And I got to network and learn from a lot of incredible professionals at Rice, through the academia and kind of the entire alumni scope of people that were in Houston and in a bunch of other Texas cities as well. And then immediately, kind of during Rice and immediately after, I spent about 2 years working in the private equity world at a firm called Affinius Capital. They used to be a part of USAA, which is one of the nation's largest insurance companies, but they have a pretty sizable real estate arm where they basically direct invest equity into developing new buildings as well as acquiring, stabilized operating buildings. So I learned a lot about how large scale funds like Affinius Capital, they accrue different funding vehicles, and they have a pretty large amount of clientele where they're raising capital from, how they develop a thesis to address, what type of housing do we want to build? Where is there, at what price point is there the most demand? How do we address development for industrial and e-commerce and things like that? And so I was given a chance to really get my hands wrapped around the housing side of things. And I focused on underwriting specifically to multifamily developments and a host of other things just related to housing fund management. And that experience was really amazing because I got to kind of be at a 10,000 foot level where you have all these different developers and firms coming to you as a capital provider saying, here's this project, here's this deal, here's this piece of land. And you work through a pretty rigorous financial mechanism to understand whether any of them work. And ultimately you build a program based off of each deal by deal. But that also led me to realize that, again, that wasn't my final landing place. I really wanted to be closer to where the formation actually takes place, where, at the developers level, the general partners level, you are actually the one going out into the market and working with brokers and finding the piece of land. And so that led me to searching for a development position. And I ultimately landed at Kettler, which is where I am today. Kettler is a 30, 40-year-old institution based in Washington, D.C., and they have a pretty historic track record of developing and managing I think it's something like 30,000 apartment units across the DMV, which encompasses the District of Washington, D.C., Virginia and Maryland, as well as several other markets throughout the East Coast United States. And they have, a pretty awesome record of building sustainable properties, new and kind of cutting edge developments that really address all the different things that we have requirements for in developments today. And just a proven way of managing multifamily and creating value for tenants, for investors, for stakeholders, and pretty much everybody involved. And so in my current role, I am focused on new investments. So I help basically select, stabilized apartment communities that we would want to invest in, or look into land and other things that we would want to buy to develop new products. So that's essentially my day to day. And I get to use a lot of financial analysis, but also kind of have the goals of sustainability and looking for ways in which we can use, better contractors, better materials, energy sources that can help push our apartment product to the top of market by being the best quality, but being the cleanest as well. And that's essentially what brought me to where I am today.
That's so interesting. You have touched like every part of sustainability and architecture so far. So I'd like to focus in our conversation more into like the financial or the investment aspect, because just recently I had a talk with a specialist in passive houses. He's called Andreu Villagrasa. He's based in Barcelona. And so I'm not going to focus on the architectural and technical details there. But I'd like to know from you in your role as investment analyst, how do you integrate sustainability factors now in your investment evaluation process? Are there specific sustainability metrics or benchmarks that Kettler prioritizes, for example, or whatever you've seen so far?
I think for Kettler specifically, we definitely have an internal mandate to where it's feasible, depending. First of all, I think it all depends on the locale you're in and, what sort of zoning restrictions you're working against. So if you're in a city that really prioritizes having environmental regulations and sustainable regulations you have to address, then that's just kind of built in and you have to make the decision whether to take that leap or not. And then in others where it's a bit more freeform, we definitely, take the leap to try and include where possible renewable energy, different things we can do with recycling and kind of building tenant behavior that we can help with the bottom line in terms of building operations and management. That's not a side that I focus on 100% of my time, but I think, getting people from kind of our operations organization, they'd be able to speak to that really, really well, because I know that having sustainable practices, whether it has to do with trash, with waste management, with resource management, especially when you're kind of dealing with energy rebilling and utility rebuilds, for basically costs that get passed to the tenant versus where in certain situations you may have to share those costs with the tenant. That's kind of always a thing that managers on the operations side are always being mindful of. And I think you have variables like insurance that really do affect our bottom line especially when you're in markets like Florida, for example, where just because of the threat of, climate disasters and hurricanes and just more and more naturally occurring disasters, those insurance costs are only forecasted to increase. So if you're building new product or if you're buying something where, you have that risk in mind, there's going to be certain strategies you're going to have to adopt with, building missile impact rated buildings that kind of stand up to the structural codes that those markets have, but also providing extra things that tenants may want, with community amenities, with just various things that address ESG for them in their experience as a resident. And so again, that's not because I work on the investment side. I think our operations team would be really well equipped to handle that. But that is something that I think Kettler has definitely in their investment focus. But it's also industry-wide is something that if you want to be a successful owner and manager, it's almost required that you have certain sustainable practices that you build in, because that's what residents are really attracted to, especially the types of residents kind of on the younger side, higher incomes, willing to pay sort of that upper echelon of rents. they're looking to have these certain features that communities might have that do address sustainability.
So that's more on the operations or management side, which is a very good input for any investor out there on how important the education for the tenants is to not leave the windows open in winter when the heating is on. And these kind of things, I guess it's also. And what's on the investment evaluation process, which is more what you focus on, right?
Yeah, and I can kind of an example I can speak to this is when I was at Affinius Capital, where going back to sort of you have this dual play of stakeholders in the investment sphere, where in a typical development or acquisition transaction, you'll probably have a general partner, which would be an owner sort of on the ground closer to the project itself, which is where Kettler would come in and serve that role. And then you'd likely have what's called a limited partner, sort of the bulk of the equity that's going into the transaction, but they're more so overseeing and not directly close to the actual transaction itself. And Affinius Capital generally would play into that sort of capital providing role where they're able to have many different financial vehicles built up of a lot of different investor clients that are trusting them with their money. And Affinius kind of has the relationships and the proven methodology to deploy that capital in all these different markets with the best in class developers and operators and make a program that, financially benefits their clients, but also benefits the end user, people like you and me that are residents or office workers or people using retail spaces and et cetera. And I think a component of that is for Affinius and I think a lot of other larger capital institutions, there's a bigger push in the industry to start adopting their funds that they have deploying into real estate to things like Gresb, the international real estate efficiency standards, and a lot of other things that specifically apply to, larger real estate capital vehicles. And so Gresb, I'm blanking out on what the acronym exactly stands for, but I know that it's an international standard that a lot of major stakeholders are requiring now. So if they invest in your fund, for example, they may tell you that, our requirement is that your fund be accredited or certified towards Gresb. And so I helped work on essentially getting some of our housing focused vehicles to align with Gresb and figure out what exactly goes into that process, because it's not a simple thing where you just kind of turn in an application and then the next day you get approved and then that's it, you get a badge. It's a pretty complicated process where depending on the size and scale of your fund, you may have a lot of different types of properties that encompass the vehicle you're managing. And for each one of those, there's a lot of details you have to provide on the construction methods, what went into each individual project, whether not only were they, achieving a certain LEED building energy certification standard, but were they also providing other things like access to public transit, access to affordable housing units baked into the market rate sort of unit mix of the building. Were they providing certain other things like community gathering amenities or certain things that can kind of be counted as addressing ESG initiatives within the Gresb framework. So that was really eye-opening for me because I got to understand, how does a fund that has so many different moving parts and, billions of dollars kind of funneling into so many different projects, all in different markets, really align to one standard, which is tough because if you have all these different projects that you have some sort of investor ownership in, trying to use some sort of blanket approach to address every facet of sustainability is difficult because, as I alluded to previously, whether you're developing something in Texas as opposed to Chicago, as opposed to Massachusetts, there's a pretty wide range of things that you might be required to do with, addressing water use and potable water or sustainable concrete or, wind impact rating or something like that. And it was a pretty interesting effort to gather, at least what are some of the common building blocks behind wood frame versus concrete construction, having sort of a minimum LEED component that I think some funds were trying to achieve. And basically, encapsulating all that information to go into the certification. So that's kind of an example of something that, you might see on the financial front of how sustainability basically forms its way at the very top of the decision making process and then really finds its way down to the actual operating level where the construction and the management decisions are made.
A few of you might know that I recently opened my own architecture studio and I just started with the podcast. I'm very excited to build a platform where I connect with inspiring people to learn along the way and share these learnings with you. So if any little thing has inspired you or if you learned anything new, I'd appreciate if you could rate the show or share my content on social media, Spotify or YouTube or wherever you listen to it. And if you think there are any touch points between you and me, I'd be super happy to connect with you. Feel free to reach out on any platform. From an investment perspective, how do sustainable properties perform in comparison to traditional ones? This might not be your main daily business, but do you know if there are noticeable differences in returns, in occupancy rates and operational costs?
I would have to speculate for sure, because I think that one of the problems with really adapting sustainable projects or just a sustainable way of constructing new product, it's not super widespread. And in my limited experience, what I feel like I've heard from veterans in the industry is that no one has really taken the full plunge to take, for example, their entire portfolio and only build it to one sustainable standard. And there's not too many examples that you can point to where you could say, building passive house multifamily is the standard. Someone still kind of needs to take that leap of faith and start to build up. And I think that there are noticeable examples like the one I'm going to talk about later in our conversation, where developers kind of in these sort of joint ventures with local institutions are advancing that. But when you look at the people building most of the building stock across the country, apartment developers, office builders, there's still kind of a minority voice in there to encompass, should we build to this airtight standard or at minimum, LEED gold or LEED platinum. And the problem is, yeah, it is expensive. There is some delta between conventional, super cheap stick build construction and the top tier of what you might get in a fully airtight, higher tier LEED certified building. In terms of returns, I think you're starting to see that as the end users of real estate, and not just, in multifamily where you kind of have everyday consumers like us, but business users that might use office space or e-commerce industrial space, those larger corporate entities, I think, are starting to have requirements that as public organizations, their stakeholders are telling them, you need to reduce your carbon footprint. So, for example, Amazon is one of the largest, if not the largest, occupiers of industrial real estate in the United States. And they've grown, the amount of industrial space they've used over the last few decades to a ridiculous, I don't even have the number off the top of my head, but they're pretty much everywhere you might go, you'll see an Amazon warehouse. And as an end user, Amazon has certain requirements that they're now trying to fulfill to become net zero by X and Y year, to fully reduce, their infrastructure footprints as much as they can, and definitely on their real estate footprint to have as low of a carbon output as possible. And so that translates into the construction process where you see developers starting to use things like mass timber with like a pretty high embodied carbon component to construct these things that you weren't seeing previously. And I think in purpose-built cases like that, in kind of the real estate world, you'd call that a build-to-suit, where you're essentially developing a space specifically catered to a renter that you probably already have a contractual obligation with. Therefore, they have specific things they might need that you wouldn't just provide in a blank, shell of a building. In those types of build-to-suit cases, you're probably getting a pretty premium return because those clients are willing to pay rents that have a premium baked in for, that upper tier cutting edge space. Whereas if they were to just lease something conventional, they would aim for a much lower price point and push it down based off of their own negotiating ability as a large renter client. So I think that's an example. And although, I regrettably don't have full numbers on all those things, I think that there is kind of a higher return delta you can get from having sustainable space. You're probably going to see that now in office space use, especially because in the United States, office values are tumbling because of return to work, because of pandemic era, work from home restrictions that are still kind of set in place. But the whole nature of work has changed. Therefore, the nature of office stock is also changing. And so if people are going to come back to work, they're only going to demand spaces that are the most high finish, the most sustainable finish, the most energy efficient to comply with their own corporate requirements on what their footprint should look like, as well as just from a tenant user standpoint of what everyday office workers might want in a nicer space that has a more consistent feel in terms of temperature and air quality and on-site amenities and things like that you didn't have in kind of the older stock that was built. So I think we'll see that higher return materialize, especially as the whole industry kind of goes through this evolution over the next few years. And in terms of building costs, that's going to be the one thing that's going to continue to be the thorn on the side for people that want to proliferate all the sustainable strategies. But the returns, I'm optimistic. I think those will continue to outpace. But this is also real estate. Anything is liable to happen, and things always happen in cycles. So while I think we should all be hopeful because governments are going to continue to want that, the end point is it depends, unfortunately.
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned before the positive impact that you see on the end users, because I had an interview with Kilai Diebel. She works for Maas. That's a company in Amsterdam that do green spaces, indoor green spaces and on roofs. And she said they also saw in lots of projects that people are willing to pay much more for their office spaces or housing units if they have a green roof on top of their building.
Yeah.
Yeah. So in your past, it might be a specific question that you might not be able to answer, but in your past experience, have you heard of like a percentage of additional cost that is considered acceptable by investors in general for sustainability purposes?
I think that's tough to put like one thumb on. There isn't one number that I think just makes the threshold. I've read in varying case studies that, for passive house, for example, you could expect upwards of like a 15 to 20% premium on your construction costs just because, you have to buy expensive materials like the types of membranes and tapes and sealants and sort of energy efficient heat exhaust recovery mechanisms that go into every aspect of the building. And so that material cost picks up, but the bigger component is also your labor cost. And I think the whole construction industry right now is going through this problem where it's really hard to find skilled laborers to fill the gaps in all these general contractors rosters. And it's hard to find people that are willing, to work in these trades on site. Because in the labor economy in the US, people's educational levels are rising, people's incomes are rising. There's less of an impetus to go into construction. And so I think there's a tough challenge that the general contracting world is trying to address by empowering those who are already in these trades and creating these sort of leadership matrices where you can encourage people to want to be on the physical side of building and help empower them through AI, through technology, and help them, manage a much larger scope of the actual construction process as opposed to maybe just, masonry or exterior painting or something like that. And basically the whole role of what the human is in construction, I think is slowly being redefined right now, especially as, materials prices go up. Investors and developers on my side of the spectrum will look to the contractors to give us savings in some other way. And that, doesn't necessarily mean just having less people, but maybe having a labor force that can reduce the schedule time or, really cover other aspects of the project timeline that they wouldn't have before. And it's sort of this push and pull that's happening. So I think that because of the labor aspect and the need for skilled labor, especially when it comes to things like passive house or lead of construction, where you need to have people that are well versed in thermal bridging, or they really understand the language that architects and engineers might be going for when they create these plans, when they tell them this is how to fully seal the building. You kind of have to have that end constructor point of it, the person that really knows how to put that together physically to address that standpoint. So those two things I think are driving up those costs. And whether it's actually 15 to 20%, whether it's more or less, I think as building technology advances, that's something you would expect to go down. But it'll be interesting to watch what materials end up becoming the main choice for things like apartment construction or office construction, and what types of certifications also become the main ones of choice. A lot of that I think will also, again, be dictated by, local municipalities. So you have the cities and the counties and the states that are going to give funding programs for people to revamp old buildings using energy efficient technologies, convert office buildings to multifamily where that makes sense, because it doesn't make sense everywhere, and then introduce new building product on vacant land, but probably in a more responsible way to where you're really being a steward of the land by building the most stringent, energy efficient standard you can. But that has to come with assistance and some aspect of, inclusionary provisions, whether it's funding, whether it's, FAR requirements that the city can make easier. And all those things really will go together to satisfy that demand.
Akbar, could you discuss a specific project you've worked on that embodies your commitment to sustainable architecture?
Sure. I don't have a specific one in my own portfolio between Kettler and Affinius that I've worked on, but I can speak to an example that's actually currently in New York City. It's called the House at Cornell Tech. It's a building that was completed in 2017. And to date, I believe, I could be wrong, but I do believe it's the tallest passive house certified freestanding structure in the world. And that's a really big deal because this building was built with a pretty impressive vision by the stakeholders that were a part of it to be differentiated from what dense urban construction actually looks like now. So this building is 26 stories. It's about 350 multifamily units. I think there's a mix of sort of student housing and market rate housing that's encompassed within that. And the building is part of Cornell University's technology campus that sits in Long Island City, close to New York, within the 5 boroughs. And so you basically have this building that, for all intents and purposes, you're in New York. It's one of the most difficult markets to do new construction in, from a safety standpoint, from a regulation standpoint, and just from a land price and cost per foot standpoint. Everything is working against you. So the fact that the developers and the stakeholders that were a part of this building were able to achieve this in and of itself is something that's a really, really big deal. And the people involved were Cornell University, where I think that speaks to one thing that's interesting is when you see buildings that are going to be built, over the next few years, over the next few decades, as a part of a larger mixed use campus, as a part of something bigger than just that building, you can really look to, I think, educational institutions to pave the way for that. American universities are centers for enormous amounts of capital through endowments, through, donations and things like that. And because they're in major cities, they control a ridiculous amount of real estate. NYU, my alma mater, is the largest landlord in New York City. Cornell, occupies a really, really interesting part of New York City that has seen a lot of new development. And so the fact that their vision from the outset, when they, did the request for proposal, was to build something like this is really significant, because these are the decision makers that are going to influence how new buildings are actually created and designed around. So I think that's one interesting aspect. Cornell worked with 2 pretty eminent New York City institutions on this, the Related Companies and the Hudson Companies, 2 development firms that are known for their track record around sustainability, large scale campuses, super, mega urban infrastructure and development. So it was a pretty solid team, and they counted people like Bureau Happold and some other really interesting architectural and engineering firms to join them. And it was definitely a team effort, as every building is, but this one in particular. So the end result of why this building is so important is because it saves almost 900 tons of CO2 per year, which is equal to about the planting of 5,300 new trees every year. And so if you kind of scaled that, if every new building in New York was built to that same standard, that would be an unbelievable reduction in the city's carbon emissions. And so I think that was part of the goal, is to make this sort of a beacon that it's possible to do something like this in New York, and it's possible to achieve this with newer buildings afterwards. Um, if you kind of go down the list of the characteristics that this building has, they're very interesting, very unique. It's on track to receive the LEED for Homes Mid-Rise Platinum certification, which is the highest of the highest tier you can possibly get within LEED. But if you kind of talk to, or you sort of read the testimonials that the developers had when discussing this building, a lot of the references are that, LEED is great, but it's sort of like a checklist where you can get points for things that may not directly have to do with energy efficiency. For example, like if you're building a park, or if you're building, a recycling compactor, which is sustainability focused, but doesn't directly target, the building's energy use or something like that. If you're close to a subway station, for example. So they packed in the need for the LEED construction alongside achieving the passive house standard, which is pretty monumental in terms of decision making, because the passive house standard, as rigorous as it is, causes you really have to work with a mold. You can't adopt one specific building practice. You kind of have to fit a lot of different strategies under one facade to address all of the various rules that passive house has, which is a lot. The 4.75 BTUs, the various other numbers, which, I can point a link to, have a pretty stringent idea of how you would make this airtight. So one of the first things they did was they created, to achieve the high level of insulation you need in a passive house certified building, they created something they call the wrap, which is a thick insulated wall with only two openings that really encompasses the full height and scale of the building structure. So if you can imagine, that's 26 stories of just full thick concrete that they literally just wrapped and built around the building, specifically to eliminate thermal bridging and as many facets for heat exchange that would then contribute to higher energy use, which in and of itself is a pretty risky thing to do, but they were able to achieve it. They used a prefabricated metal panel system, which for me, coming from the modular world, is really fascinating to see. You're basically taking finished aspects of the building facade that also include windows and siding, and you're building those on a factory floor, temperature controlled, fully enclosed. You're probably shipping them or doing some other way of getting them to the site, and basically hanging them in place the way you might hang, Lego pieces or other components to a larger set. To do that on a 26-story building is also a pretty crazy effort, because there's so much coordination that has to go into having cranes on site, having truck transport for the finished products on site, having, people maintaining QA and QC to make sure that the factory built product doesn't get damaged en route or upon installation. So it's a pretty crazy circus you have to manage to do that. But upon doing so, they were able to minimize a lot of different aspects of thermal bridging. They had less joints in general. They used mega panels that are about 30 to 35 feet wide that also combine to add to that air tightness of the building. Another thing they did was to address the project cost, kind of like what we were talking about, minimizing how much of a huge premium you might have by going for something like passive house. They use normal cast in place concrete for the structure and pretty standard interior finishes you'd see on a new apartment building. But in their construction methods that they use to kind of seal the building, to make sure that, every aspect of where you'd have outdoor openings and aspects for heat recovery exchange, they were able to minimize the glazing to about 23%. And through the dense amount of insulation they use, the property average is equated to R19, which is a really high number in terms of insulation that you can get on a building of that size. So you have a building that's that high with that many apartment units, that many users that are occupying the building at any one time, and standing somewhere like New York City that obviously, is exposed to a lot of different weather elements, whether it's the winter cold, intense summer heat that kind of gets exacerbated because of the heat island effect that Manhattan experiences due to climate change, rising water, rising air conditions, and things like that. And this is a building that's really made to address and stand firm in its energy use against all of those things, which is pretty interesting. When it came to the building's actual ventilation and heating and cooling systems, their vision was to use these mechanisms called ERVs, which are energy recovery ventilators, which essentially recycle exhaust air from what the building is outputting and using the energy from that exhaust to treat fresh supply air. And that saves you a lot on your energy costs because, again, you're pretty much just recycling the air and using fresh air that gets treated through that to span every apartment unit without having to have an individual unit in each apartment. They were able to use custom ERVs that they procured to address the entire building and a central ventilation system that apartment users can address through their individual thermometers and what have you, but that ultimately reduces the amount of maintenance and issues you might have for the entire building envelope because you just have a couple of recovery, air filters at the very top of the building you have to clean, as opposed to individual ones in every single apartment unit. So that also contributes to better efficiency in the building maintenance and operations too. And when it comes to the actual heating and cooling, they use something called a variable refrigerant evaporator, units that basically supply cooled air to the lower floors where cold air settles anyway. And that helps contribute to the overall footprint with the ERV supplying treated air to the topmost floors too. So overall, there's just a long list of different energy efficiency techniques that the developers and the owners were able to achieve in this one building that got to kind of that end line. And as I alluded to, it's not one thing. It's like 100 different things in little granular details that they had to do. But ultimately, they created something that I think is really going to stand the test of time. It's a beautiful building. It really stands out in New York skyline. I would recommend anyone go and visit it if they get a chance to go to New York, because it's definitely, like I said, a beacon to what new commercial residential construction can be when you do it with the right vision in mind.
I'm definitely going to check out the project. That was a wonderful analysis that showed your passion for sustainable architecture. Really, really nice. Thank you so much, Akbar, for your insights. It has been super interesting, and I love the different approach from all the architects I talk to usually. Thank you so much.
Thank you, and thank you for having me. I appreciate the platform.
A huge thank you for listening. Make sure you subscribe to the show wherever you listen to the podcast to support me and so you don't miss an episode. And while you're there, I'd also be so grateful if you could rate and review us. If you have any guest suggestions or any feedback, you can find me on the socials at Ladina Schöpf. Thanks.